So, thank you for joining us today for the fourth edition of the webinar in the topic of interlinkages between climate change and SDGs. So, this webinar series is initiated by the Young-led Climate Partnership, supported by TYK Research and Action Consultant and Energy Academy Indonesia, or ECADIN. My name is Anissa Trianti. I'll be your host and also moderator for today. So we'll start with the narratives that sustainable development is a complex and meta-level issues. It actually reflects human activities of our societal system in many different angles and dimensions. The Sustainable Development Goals is actually a momentum to understand that the whole picture and also try to understand also about how reality works. Each of the goals are interlinked, meaning that ignoring one goals will actually disrupt the achievement of another goals. SDGs is actually very ambitious in terms of practice, but it is unavoidable and must be attained to ensure sustainability of our world. And for the next 60 minutes, we will approach the SDGs through the climate change perspective. We all know that Paris Agreement under auspices of the UNFCCC was established in the same year of SDGs, which is in 2015. It is a huge windows, therefore, of synergy between the two frameworks. And practically speaking, if we don't achieve Paris Agreement, we will not achieve the SDGs, and also another way around. So talking about synergy and trade-offs, there's a couple of examples of current thematic challenges. The first one is consumption and production, the need to feed our people versus unsustainable practices. The second one is land use management. There are hard choices has to be made: farms and agriculture, industry, forest conservation. The outcome of the special report on climate change and land, which is recently launched in 2019 in August, showed that we currently use the land for as a carbon emitter rather than carbon sinks. Plastic waste also contributes to carbon emission. There's a problem of producing renewable energy. And above all, it's not only choices between sustainable and unsustainable practices, but there's also hard choices between sustainable practices to mitigate climate change and adapting the impact of climate change. So against this background, this webinar tried to answer three questions. The first one is, what are the trade-offs and synergy between climate change and sustainable development? The second one, how can it be translated to priorities and coherent policies at the national and subnational level? And last but not least, what would be the role of young people to enhance synergy and manage the trade-offs between climate change and SDGs? So today we have two amazing speakers with us, and very resourceful, and they're expert in their own field. I would first introduce to you our first speaker. Her name is Abi Yunita. She is a PhD candidate at the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development in Utrecht University, the Netherlands. She is currently working as a researcher in the Global Goals Project, where she conducts country case studies to assess the steering effects of SDGs at the national and subnational level. And before commencing her PhD, she was based in Andhra Pradesh in India and worked as research officer with the Sustainable India Finance Facility. And our second speaker is Elena Creed. Hi, Elena. Thanks a lot for joining us. We're in a different time zone, so really appreciate your time for being one of our speakers. She is a manager for the UN's Sustainable Development Solution Network, where she focuses on special initiatives for the Deep Decarbonization Pathways project. And also she serves as a central SDSN lead for the annual Low Emission Solution Conference launched at the COP22 in Morocco. Part of Elena's core portfolio is to help bring low emission solutions to decision makers across networks and sectors to help implement the Paris Agreement. Without further ado, I would actually like to invite Abi Yunita to share with us, based on your expertise and experience, about this topic of interlinkages between SDGs and climate change. So Abby, over to you.
Great. I'm just going to quickly share my presentation. So thank you so much, Anissa, for that introduction. It's really great to be here. And thank you also to the organizers for organizing such a wonderful series of webinars. I've listened to a couple and they've been really good. So just to get straight into it because of time limitations, I want to reiterate in very simple terms why climate action is absolutely necessary for the Sustainable Development Goals. And the first is because social systems obviously depend on functioning ecological systems, and this depends very much on a stable climate. And so if we don't do anything about climate change, and the effects of climate change exacerbates or worsens, we not only risk our future and heighten uncertainty in the present, but we can unravel any progress we've made on a range of indicators for the SDGs. And even though climate change or the adverse effects of climate change are not really felt everywhere now, they will affect every place and everyone. This was quite pronounced to me when I arrived in the Netherlands earlier this year. Everyone was still quite reminiscent of the memorable summer you had last year. It was a nice long summer, but I came from Australia and we were experiencing droughts then, and it's still continuing now. So yeah, so this still affects, climate change affects all aspects of development everywhere. And although we don't feel quite necessarily the same impacts right now. So against that backdrop, I think to understand interlinkages between climate change and sustainable development, we need to understand the trade-offs involved in past and also present decisions that we make. And the typology I have here was developed in the context of ecosystem service valuation, but I think it's important and useful to use this to establish linkages between sustainable development goals and the climate goal. And I'm going to use Indonesia's oil palm sector as an example, just to illustrate these different types of trade-offs. So spatial trade-offs are basically, quite simply, benefits accrued here, cost imposed elsewhere, or vice versa. With oil palm, it's produced in specific localities around the world. Indonesia is one of the largest producers, but it's consumed everywhere. So the costs and benefits of its production and consumption, they're not evenly distributed across space. Temporal trade-offs, we benefit now, but bear the cost later. Indonesia has had incredible growth and lifted a lot of people from poverty through its oil palm developments, but the cost of that are becoming more and more severe. This includes, of course, increasing greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity loss. Interpersonal trade-offs concern people, so some people win and others lose. And if we look at oil palm, it's a private good. And if it's continued to be produced in an unsustainable way, we would do that at the cost of a lot of public goods. So this includes, for example, the biodiversity I mentioned earlier, and I guess its impact on climate change. So this is an SDG wedding cake. It was developed by the Stockholm Resilience Center, and I put it here because I think it's illustrative of a lot of the things I just mentioned. As you see at the very bottom, the foundation of the cake, they're all biosphere goals. So we have life on land, life below water, water and sanitation, and of course, climate action. And this foundation is what our social systems and our economic systems are built on. But unfortunately, if you look at a closer look, for example, at SDG 2, which I think touches on all of the SDGs, the way that we have in the past tackled hunger have come at severe costs to the very foundation, these ecological foundations that global food systems rely on. So for example, soil, which is actually non-renewable in the sense that it's not recoverable within a lifetime, is being degraded quite quickly. The recent IPCC special report on climate change and land that you mentioned said that climate change, our soil is being lost more than 100 times faster than it is being formed in plowed areas. And even in untilled fields, we are still losing healthy soil. Agriculture, forestry, and other types of land use also account for 23% of anthropogenic emissions, and that's incredible. I don't know if it's, I know that previous figures in not so long ago estimate that that's larger than all transportation combined. So it's quite significant. So if we want to progress towards SDG 2, we need to first recognize the trade-offs that have been, I guess, that have materialized because of the past decisions we've made, and account them into current decision-making strategies. And, you know, we need to think, for example, that agriculture is by far the biggest employer in the world globally. And to sustain these livelihoods, we need to make them more sustainable. We can also link it to SDG 5, gender equality. Much agricultural labor is done by women, and so to progress to zero hunger, we need to account for women's rights, etc., and recognize them as farmers in their own right. Okay, so because of this time limitation, so Elena will elaborate on this later, that we know much more now about the trade-offs between all dimensions of the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals and 169 targets. But translating these goals into national context, it goes and filters through a political process. And in the case of Indonesia, I guess since independence and since 1967, when a lot of land use demarcation was happening, Indonesia's development has been supported by natural resource exploitation. And so to reorient, and so they know now that they have made these decisions and they've grown from it, but they are having to face the consequences now. And moving forward, translating global climate and development goals will need to take a lot of vigilance and perseverance, and also a lot of involvement from those beyond the government. And I think this is taking place now in Indonesia, where developing our next midterm development plan, and the SDGs are being mainstreamed in the plan. It will be launched early next year, but they published a report because they launched an initiative, a low carbon development initiative, to kind of take stock of all of these things, look at existing policies, take into account stakeholders' views, and trying to figure out how they can create or chart a pathways that take into account these trade-offs. But I think, and civil society is of course involved, including World Resources Institute. They're involved in the low carbon development initiative. But the point that I'm trying to make here is the last development plans relies a lot on natural resource extraction. The next one will be really important. So like in translating these goals need to be transparent. They need to be held accountable by multiple parties to make sure that they really do account for these trade-offs across contexts. So perhaps I will talk about some of these knowledge gaps during the discussion, because I want to touch on the role of youth. I think just very quickly, young people have really shown a lot of leadership on climate change and sustainable development, actually. I think a lot of this action has created a political momentum and pressure. And I think it's because they're really good at storytelling. They're very compelling storytellers, because especially for millennials, they've grown in a time of uncertainty. So they really live with they will or feel that they are living with the consequences of decisions that other people have made for them. They're quite innovative. In Indonesia, there are a lot of spaces for youth, including there are some in Jakarta and in Bandung that host people and mobilize youth, and they put exhibitions and community organize. They do a lot of community organizing, and these things I think are really great for youth to kind of spread awareness. But also they partake in really important solutions in terms of infrastructure and cleaning up some of the sort of mess that has been made, including, if you remember a few years ago, a Dutch student developed a tool a method to clean up ocean plastic. I thought that was pretty cool. And these sorts of innovations are sort of emerging everywhere. And I think that's quite hopeful. I'll leave it there because I think we've gone over time, but over to Elena.
Great, thanks so much, Abby, for a very interesting presentation. And I think there's a lot of things that we can also elaborate more. You mentioned about political issues, engagement, inclusion, and multi-stakeholders participation. These are the things that kind of character of sustainable development, especially in the governance part. Well, when you face complexity, of course, there's a lot of development in terms of number of actors that get involved, and then, of course, the homework is then how with the coordination mechanism and how to actually solve the problem of inefficiency in terms of policy, for example. But I would like to first go to Elena to give her presentation. And one more thing before we're going to Elena is that for those of you who are now watching via YouTube Live, you can actually ask questions and give also comments. And hopefully after the presentation, we could ask this question to our remarkable speakers. So over to you, Elena.
Thank you, Anissa. Hi, everyone. My name is Elena Creed. I work with the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. All right, let me see if I can figure out a sharing here. All right, do you see my presentation? Is it in the correct view? Yes.
Yes, we can see it clearly.
Oh, sorry. All right, great. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on the metrics and some of the indicators and targets so that we can really answer that question of what are the trade-offs and what is our current understanding here. And so because we're asking the question of the SDGs and climate change, I just wanted to make sure that I know everybody has seen this grid, or I hope everyone has seen this grid, but what the SDGs are and what do they encompass, and then talking about how climate change impacts them. So this is an agenda from 2015 to 2030. We have 17 goals. Within these goals are 169 targets and over 232 indicators. So that just kind of demonstrates the complexity of this agenda. And I'm gonna first off apologize for this slide because I know there's a lot of information here, but what this is showing, this is from the online SDG Tracker. So if anybody listening is interested to understand where any particular indicator or SDG generally is on pace to meet its goal, go online and you can check out the SDG Tracker. But this is basically depicting the 232 indicators across all of the SDGs. And also showing which indicators that we currently do not have global monitoring data for. So which are just absolutely not being tracked and that there is not data to collect is all of the indicators here in red. So there's definitely a major data gap generally for the SDGs overall, but we do have a functioning framework here that we can use to compare progress across countries and at least understand some of the spillover impacts from different goals. So where does the climate change and climate action fit in here? It's an easy question and easy answer. So SDG 13 is on to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. I wanted to just call this out quickly and explain the asterisks. This is the only SDG out of the 17 that has an asterisk, and many people don't understand exactly what it means, but it's actually giving the UNFCCC denotion as the primary international and intergovernmental forum for the negotiations around climate change. And this is basically the Paris Agreement. So this is how the Paris Agreement and climate change formally fits within the SDG framework. And I just wanted to also provide this diagram here, which I pulled from a paper from Nature Sustainability, but this is just giving you a visual depiction of the 2030 agenda, which is the largest circle here, and how the Paris Agreement and the nationally determined contributions, which is countries' targets and ambitions towards decarbonization, fit actually within the 2030 agenda. So last year, the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, published their 1.5 report. So the IPCC is basically the scientific governing body of climate change for the UN. So they're the ones who bring consensus around the 2 degree and 1.5 degree and helped articulate that in the Paris Agreement. In their 1.5 report, they actually have an entire chapter that looks at the implications on sustainable development in a 1.5 and 2 degree increase world. And so I extracted this table quickly just so that you understand that this information is there and is available. And also kind of to drive the point that in a 2 degree world, things basically get much worse. And this all links back to the SDGs. So no need to go over this in detail, and you can go check it out online if you're interested. But going back to that agriculture example that we talked about earlier, in a 1.5 world, we see significant declines in crop yields avoided, although some yields may increase. This is primarily due to temperate high latitude regions increasing in temperature. However, when we get to the 2 degree scenarios, we see that the average global crop yields decline. So crop production over the entire globe would decline. So this has a direct impact on SDG 2 to end hunger and achieve food security. Just making sure. So a few other examples of the adverse impacts that climate change might have on the SDGs. So the agriculture example we've already gone over, so I'll skip that. Also, climate change potentially could exacerbate competition and conflict, which may threaten peace and security and social justice. This happens when there's scarce resources and unstable economies, which lead to conflict. Climate change related disasters can also be drivers of human displacement and mass migrations. Some have hypothesized that the current migrations in Central America, where migrants are coming to the US because of extreme environmental degradation and inability to sustain crops from season to season, is a result of climate change. I don't think that that's been concluded yet, but the drivers are definitely there. And then the last point here is climate change and ecosystem impacts. So deglaciation, ocean acidification, desertification, invasive species, and habitat loss. So we're talking about our global fisheries, sea level rise in most of our major cities, which are in coastal regions, and then even proliferation of disease and invasive species. So these are some major human impacts. This list is very much so not exhaustive. I just want it to be exemplary and also to demonstrate just how complex this is. These are not a cause and effect relationship. These are very much webs of interactions, which get very complicated very quickly. So kind of the point I'm making here is on how SDGs and climate change are linked in kind of twofold way. So this is a conclusion taken from a paper that was published in June this year in Nature Sustainability. And part of their conclusion was how climate change exacerbates development challenges. So they found that actions to achieve 72 of the 169 targets within the SDGs is undermined by climate change, and that they found evidence directly linking that causality. And a secondary conclusion they had was about the trade-offs and synergies. They identified evidence of synergies between climate action and 134 targets across all SDGs. The wording there isn't perfect, but I'm going to unpack that in more detail in a moment. So this is to that first point about the 72 targets that are going to be undermined by climate change. So all of the red in this graphic are demonstrating which of the targets for each of the goals could potentially be negatively impacted by climate change, for which there is evidence published for. So this is not insignificant. So it's really important that we start thinking about our climate projections and how they may impact some of our sustainability goals. And then to unpack this further, sorry, I'll go back. If you look at SDG 15 right here, I just wanted to kind of look more closely at exactly what that's saying. So I highlighted the targets that they indicated would be impacted by climate change. There's not anything majorly surprising here. Obviously, restoration of our land, biodiversity, desertification, habitat loss, all could be adversely impacted by climate change. The big takeaway here is how the SDGs and the SDG targets can be a common language or a framework to start tracking these things and for comparing progress across different geographies and different regions. And then looking at that second point a bit closer, so the evidence of synergies between climate action and 134 targets. So what you're looking at here is the synergies and trade-offs between climate action and the SDGs. So all of the green boxes are where they have found evidence showing synergies between climate action and that SDG. And where you see orange is where they show canceling or conflicting trade-off between that SDG and climate action. One of the bigger takeaways in this part of the analysis was that they actually found 4 times more synergies than conflicts, showing that there's a lot of opportunity and gains to be made by better understanding the interaction between climate change and these SDGs. And so unpacking that a little bit further, sorry, I'll go back. So looking at SDG 7, which is in the top middle there, SDG 7 I chose, it's kind of very obviously linked with climate action. So all 5 of its targets are directly linked. However, there are some that potentially are also conflict with climate goals. So those are highlighted here. And this is primarily to do with the concept of emissions reduction. So in Africa and a lot of the developing world right now, people don't necessarily have access to the grid or to sustainable and affordable electricity. And as we extend that access, we're going to increase the environmental and carbon footprint of those populations, which if you look purely at emissions reduction standards within Goal 13 or within climate action language, you're actually not making progress there in that sense, although obviously it's very important to give everybody access to electricity. In the long term, renewable energy is hopefully going to be the answer there. However, there's really high upfront cost for clean electricity. And so how decision makers value that and how they take into multi-decadal timescales for investments that have large capital upfront costs, and especially in resource limited settings, is not an easy answer, and it's not something that is a one size fits all. That's going to be very context specific, and it's the challenges ahead of us. So just looking at my time. Okay, we're doing okay. Anissa, am I okay, or do you want me to rush close?
No, go ahead, Elena.
Oh, okay, great. So I just wanted to highlight some of the challenges that were pulled out in those examples, and then I'm also going to hopefully end here on a positive note about solutions and the role of youth. So some of the challenges are the access to timely data. So that was demonstrated by that SDG Tracker, and this lack of overall access within the SDG framework, but also for climate action. Also the fact that solutions must be designed for local conditions and local contexts. There's definitely no one size fits all. And given that energy systems and emission sources are either privatized, public, they can be cross geographic boundaries. There is not necessarily a policy framework that can be applied across the board. And this is pretty complicated. Yeah, so also that the SDG framework must be contextualized and localized is another point to take away here. So not all of the 169 targets are relevant to all countries, nor do they have the capacity to track all of that data. One really obvious answer is kind of malaria proliferation in developed countries. It's not necessarily a really telling indicator for them. Also, just the point that long-term planning and political cycles don't align, which I think has been very apparent in the last few years as we've kind of taken one step forward and two steps back on some climate action in some countries that I won't mention. Also that several international agreements and reporting structures currently don't align. This is one thing that I found in the literature about there's a high level political forum for the SDGs each summer at the UN. And then there's also the Conference of Parties, which is more in the winter for the UNFCCC process. And so they have different reporting structures for countries for each of these. And yet at the moment, there is no direct alignment with how they feed into each other. So hopefully that's something that we can see the UN do better at, and countries, make better use of their reporting time in the future. Competing priorities, very tougher decision makers. I kind of already made that point earlier. And this last point about GDP, this is something that comes out in our World Happiness Report quite apparently. GDP is not necessarily a good measure of sustainable development nor human well-being, yet it's the one that's most often quoted as a national indicator for success around the world. And so this kind of language and benchmarking really needs to evolve if we're going to really start understanding these trade-offs and measuring success towards them in a different way. And so here are the solutions. I kind of have pulled out 6 projects here that I am familiar with and aware of that are working on trying to fill in this understanding and this knowledge gap in the trade-offs between the SDGs and climate change. The first here is FABLE. This is a global consortium. It's basically a modeling project that's working to understand what are the different pathways for land use and sustainable ecosystems, and how do the trade of our agricultural products and our commercial goods impact the development of other countries. And so they just released their first report. So it's looking at the food, agriculture, biodiversity, land use, and energy interactions. The second example here is Nature Map. This is a shameless SDSN plug because this is a project that we're pioneering that is actually going to be beta launched this month at the Climate Action Summit in September. And so this is a map that's looking at global biodiversity hotspots, which also tend to be very much carbon storage hotspots and have other ecosystem services included. So how do you quantify, measure, and then understand the interactions between those and our human systems? And then looking at that in a geospatially explicit mapping environment. So that will be available later next month. The NBC Partnership, Abby, you mentioned the WRI and a lot of the work that they're doing. This is another one of their initiatives where they're working to bring networks and experts directly to countries who are working on their long-term strategies and trying to understand how their climate goals can enhance and align with their sustainable development goals. So it's a really interesting initiative. This one on the right here for the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, their 4-sector SDG roadmap. I included this because of not only the recent report by the IPCC on land, but also in their 4th assessment report, the IPCC mentioned that forest management will have the largest sustained climate mitigation benefit out of all efforts. And I think that that point remains true today. So the World Business Council is currently working with private businesses who work in the forestry sector to better understand the value chain within the forest sector and the commodities it produces, but also from a sustainability perspective as a carbon sink and storage vehicle, and how can businesses support developing that value chain in a more all-encompassing way. So they have a report out right now that's very interesting and also maps directly to the SDGs. Last 2 here, and then I promise I'll wrap up. The SDSN Youth Local Pathway Fellowship. SDSN has basically a sister network of youth working around the world to localize the SDGs in different forums. The Local Pathways Fellowship is one example of one of their programs. It's partnering youth with their local cities to work intimately with their cities to develop pathways to sustainable development. And many times climate change and/or emissions reduction is the entry point for these pathways. So this is a fellowship program where youth are given mentorship, sponsorship, and resources to work directly with the cities in which they reside. So go check that out if that sounds interesting. And the last one is the SDG Students Program, which is a global network of student hubs where students come together to engage and learn about action on the SDGs. So this is kind of across the forum. If you're just interested to learn more and to localize, this is a forum for you to get involved with. So main takeaways, and I promise I'll finish. The SDGs and climate change are explicitly linked. That's very apparent, and we're understanding more and more exactly how. However, there are currently knowledge gaps in that understanding. So we understand that they are linked. We understand the general basis of the relationship, but we don't understand the complexities of the knock-on effects and the spillover impacts of different actions across our human and natural systems and a changing climate. And then there is also more evidence available on the synergies rather than the trade-offs of SDGs and climate change. So if you're listening and you're a youth, there is still so much work in this area to be done, so get involved. Some ways that youth can help address these gaps is by joining a network. SDSN Youth is a great example. Also looking into more technical training and workforce development in new technologies. This is kind of my area of expertise is technology frontier. And I know that a big metric that continuously comes out is that there's a huge worker gap projecting into the future of really technical, hands-on renewable energy positions. So if that interests you, it's definitely a long-term career plan. Get involved politically. Youth are amazing at campaigning. I've seen it time and time again with our SDSN Youth Network. Exactly what that means can be very different in different contexts, but we'd be happy to talk to you more about what that could look like for you. And then also investigating sustainability programs at your office or your school. I'm happy to report SDSN just recently started to do that to look at the different sustainability metrics within our own office and our operations. But that's also something that anybody can pretty much do anywhere because there's enough online resources to do so. All right, I finally am done.
Thanks so much, Elena. I think that's a really nice presentation and very easy to understand, also with a lot of visuals. I think I will check first in our YouTube comments if there are any comments so far. Okay, so for those of you again watching this via live stream, please just send your comments. We still have around, let's see, around 20 minutes before this webinar ends. While waiting for your comments, I do have some follow-up questions. Maybe I'll start first with Elena, because you just finished it, it's still fresh. You mentioned about reporting mechanism. I think that's very interesting, because reporting, I think a lot of nations actually already have the ambition. They follow through the SDGs, they follow through the climate change. But the problem is the limited budget as well, especially for developing countries. Where should they finance this reporting? And I think it is very crucial for government to take lead on this, because NGOs or other civil societies or networks can actually initiate a lot of different projects. But in the end, government should be the one, if they have the most powerful steering mechanism, to actually coordinate and link these different projects, and they can use it to serve the need of their nations. It would be great if you can elaborate a little bit, especially from your experience working with different, representation of nations.
Absolutely. That's a great question. I would actually kind of flip it around though, and I'm going to just ask myself a different question, but it's related, but it's not necessarily a question of where does the financing or how do you fund nations to do such, but it's like, where can you find the efficiencies across different ministries, and where can you combine efforts? So we've seen this across different countries, that the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Energy, the Ministry of Environment, and even the statistical offices, which actually have access to the data that you need a lot of times to do this reporting and track them, don't necessarily talk on any kind of regular basis, nor are they using similar or translatable metrics. So they're kind of all doing their own things, spending their own budgets, and then reporting to the UN in different individual siloed tracks. So if there could be an effort within countries to really start connecting internally across those ministries, which I think there is, and the NBC Partnership is one example of an effort that is helping countries to do that. There's many others. I know ICLEI, Sustainability for Local Governments, are trying to connect, city governments in with these national processes, but really identifying these efficiency mechanisms within how our governments collect data and report on it, whether for these purposes or others, is going to be an easy win. Abby, I'm sure you might have something to add here too, specifically maybe in the context of Indonesia, because I know they've actually been a really great pioneer in this space as well.
Go ahead, Abby.
Yeah, I think inter-ministerial coordination is really important, but I think even within specific ministries, sometimes departments exist still in silo in the same institution. So I think that is also something that people need to really pay attention to, because when we talk about institutional integration or linking them better, we always talk about institutions working across different sectors. How can we connect them together? But actually, governments are big, ministries are big, even municipalities are. So I think within these institutions, there needs to be better coordination. And in terms of reporting, especially on the indicators, not every government has the data for the vast range of SDG indicators. So yeah, like you said, Elena, before, like there is a massive gap, or data gap, that needs to be filled. Those are my 2 cents.
Thanks so much, Abby. Okay, we're still waiting for your comments from all of our participants online. I'll go back to you, Abby. You mentioned about these knowledge gaps. I think one of my biggest curiosity is actually about what would be the role of civil society on filling these knowledge gaps. You mentioned about, silos. between ministries. But do you think that civil society actually have roles to kind of be the agent for linking different ministries, or trying to be how do you call it, to build, for example, a shadow reporting type of thing? I know that this can be very various different countries depending on the characteristic of civil society and government relations. But what is your insight on this based on your experience working with different countries?
So I think from my experience in Indonesia, but also in India more recently, civil society plays a very big role in putting different issues on the agenda in terms of policy making. And I think this is important given the complexity of the SDG framework and the political process that is inherent in their translation into these different contexts. I think because civil society organizations are more kind of connected, I guess, to different experiences that are more embedded in local context, they can really bring even, because the thing is with national translations or national development agendas, like if issues are not on the table, like the trade-offs are not going to be identified and the synergies are not going to be exploited. And so I think that they play a really big role in that. And they also play a big role in I guess, holding governments accountable to their commitments. And in Indonesia, I think more and more, especially with the last two terms, like the Jokowi, and even during SBY era, there's sort of more of a partnership developing between NGOs and governments. And I think that's especially, I think, in the forestry sector. Obviously, the forestry sector is very political, but for example, the AMAN, the Indigenous Peoples Alliance of the Archipelago in Indonesia, has played a really, really big role in pushing for land reforms. It was put on the agenda for in the first term of the Jokowi administration. They also play a really big role in helping communities assert their rights, and also like kind of showing the social and environmental trade-offs that accompany many economic decisions in the past, especially in the forestry sector. So I think, yeah, they have a big role to play.
Elena, do you have anything to add from Abby?
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about what popped in my head was the Marrakesh Partnership. So, I mean, a few years ago in the UN Conference of Parties and the UNFCCC formal process, private businesses and NGOs weren't really allowed or didn't have an actual formal mechanism to feed into those. And only in the last few years has the Marrakesh Partnership been formed, which allows that entry point. Because civil society and NGOs and entities outside the government, they basically can take a lot more risks. They don't have as much to lose, and they don't have the political momentum to worry about. So they can pioneer solutions that maybe the government would never even look at because it's not proven. And they can also serve as the case studies for specific new initiatives that you're not really quite sure what the outcome is going to be, but having that demonstration project for them is crucial in order to scale up and get larger investments, and for governments to eventually take ownership of those kinds of projects. So yeah, innovation, I see they're a big role for them in the innovation space, I guess, to put a long answer short.
Yes, but I think to reflect back to my experience with the youth organization, there's a lot of practices where government work together with the youth and really include them in the policy making. But I guess even though with recent activism, great leadership from Greta, for example, and school strike for climate, the engagement, it seems like still at the stage level to some countries, especially the situation, socio-political situation is really diverse. There's country that is very vulnerable to political unrest, for example, which means that their youth could actually could not speak for themselves, and also talking more about pushing more government to do something for climate change and synergy to SDGs. It's something that's very far away. So I guess we have like around 10 minutes. I would like to hear from you. Maybe, of course, there's no easy solution for this. But what do you think is the crucial steps to move forward with the synergy? Do you think it's really actually makes sense to talk about synergy while it's very complex? Do you think we should really just focus on something relevant with current governance mechanism with the silos? What do you think about this? I will also ask that to you, Abby. So please go ahead, Elena.
Yeah, I mean, so initially my first thought is the importance of long-term planning, which I think then would kind of capture a lot of these synergies depending on how long out you're looking towards. But I think that is a notion that we've lost at our national level in the last few years or decades. But really thinking about what is the actions we take today, what does that mean for generations in 50 years? And then also, what does that mean for other sectors and other parts of society, and looking at the economy as a really complex and living organism. And then that way also getting to the systems transformation that we need to see, because it's not going to be simple. It's not going to be one policy. It's not going to be one technology. We're going to need to change the entire way that we live and consume our goods moving forward if we're going to actually achieve the SDGs and maintain the resources of our planet. And then I just wanted to make one other point, and he said to your previous discussion about the role of youth, one part that I'll mention that I'm really hopeful about is, I mean, this generation of youth is now very large, and it's a huge proportion of society globally. So not only encouraging our governments to take action, but actually starting to become part of those governments and running for office and getting involved in a very hands-on way is extremely exciting. And we're already seeing it even in the US elections currently, and across the states, we're seeing younger and younger delegates join and have a real voice. And so I think that's a really hopeful indicator.
Thank you, Elena. I guess that will be really motivating for our youth viewers right now. Abby?
Yeah, I agree with everything Elena said. I think long-term planning is really important. And I think with that, we need to kind of change the metrics of development. You mentioned in your presentation that the GDP is really outdated. It doesn't capture the complexity of the development agenda we currently have, but it's never been able to capture anything other than the flows of goods and services and the production and consumption within a specific country. So I think for kind of a system to transition to become more sustainable, they need to kind of value sort of other aspects of development beyond just economic growth. And I think, yeah, young people getting involved at various levels. I have a colleague at work who is very much involved in her municipality, as well as she's a PhD candidate, and she brings a lot of fresh ideas, I'm sure, to her municipality. And I think with the US example, a lot of really visionary kind of development pathways have been have been crafted by younger politicians and younger representatives. It's the same with I'm not from New Zealand, but I think Jacinda Ardern, she's quite visionary as well. And yeah, I think they're able to kind of plant the seeds for change within existing institutions. I think that's very helpful and hopeful.
Great. Thanks so much, Abby and Elena. I'm not sure if I could give a justice to and summarize and give justice to your presentation. This is indeed a very complex issues, and I think we have very big challenges, but also there's a lot of opportunities as well to make synergy happen. And to manage the trade-offs between this climate change actions and the achievement of SDGs. I guess my takeaway is more about that. I think transformation cannot be done quickly. It's a process, and the complexity and the time that we have to spend. We should acknowledge it as a reality, the complexity of the world. And what I think could be useful is also to talk more about partnership, about leadership, because these are qualities that could actually link up each other. And of course, youth has tremendous energy, and they really motivated to change the world for the better, to make sure that we still have future generations. And I guess our role is to actually keep supporting them. And I do agree that, government has limits in terms of their power and capability to tackle these issues. We should really work together because this is not a simple issues. Climate change and sustainable development. So, a little bit announcement. We are already at the end of our webinar, but we'll have the next webinar on the 20th. It's on the 11th September. It's our 5th webinar about climate knowledge, behavior, and action. And this webinar will be led by Thomas Josiah Glenn from King's College London, UK. I'm sure that they will have a very interesting follow-up conversation about and discussion about climate knowledge. I hope that you guys can stay tuned to the Energy Academy Indonesia YouTube channel. And before closing, I would like to thank Abby and Elena for joining us. It's really nice that you can share your knowledge and expertise. I also would like to thank Sharif Riyadi and Desi Akano from Ekadin, who actually work behind the curtains now, trying to make sure that our webinar go very smooth, and Ibu Yanti Kusmanto from PYK Research and Action Consultant. Yeah, I think that's it. Thanks so much, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.